really need to think long and hard, because to dovetail on another topic, which is related to mobility as a service and public transport, is the role of on-demand transit. Because here in Europe, on-demand transit is simply a feeder service. It basically reinforces that central role of well-performing bus, rail, metro lines, fixed routes. They do not get replaced. Unfortunately, North America, a lot of them are getting replaced, or they're being rethought of as zone-based geographic coverages, which serve a purpose for what we call transit deserts. And I think transit desert is a valid term in the industry, but we have to be very careful of the policy choices we make, because, again, with public transport, it's a matter of pure geometry, or to quote Jarrett Walker from Portland, Oregon, it's a trade-off between coverage and ridership. You cannot have both. Yep. So by simple mathematical geometry, you can cover as many riders in a short geographic zone, or you can cover less riders in a wider geographic zone. But as we Americans say, you cannot have your cake and eat it too. You have to make a policy choice.
Yep. That's correct. And you need to have a balance, but I think technology can support you in that matter. But it's actually great that you have a lot of experience with the American, the American landscape in terms of public transport. And you talked about a great point. You said that in the United States, the public transport is a little bit behind when it comes to here in Europe. And also you talked about the single-use vehicle, but I want to dig a little bit deeper into that. Don't you think maybe in the United States it's related to the infrastructure, for example? Because I know the roads in the United States are different than the roads here in Europe. Obviously, also the landscape in the United States, you have a lot of wider landscape where for public transports like a bus or a tram is not that ideal. While here in Europe, like in Lisbon, for example, it's the perfect place to have a tram, because Lisbon, everything is close to each other. Everything is like, made for a tram, basically. So I would like to have your opinion to why the United States is lacking behind that part. Is it related to the infrastructure of the roads, for example? And also, I want to discuss the new transport bill, the trillion transport bill. Obviously, I saw on Twitter that people were a bit they weren't that happy. They were a bit disappointed, and I want to have your opinion on that as well, because I see that they are still
including myself. I wrote an article in ITS International about that.
Exactly, yes. Exactly. I saw it on your Twitter, actually. I also want to understand why in the United States they are still promoting EV trucks, instead of like because public transport can be like trains, can be very useful in the United States because you have such a wide landscape. So why is there not a push from the government to use more public transport instead of having like the boring company where you have like underground tunnels with the car?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's a lot for us to cover here and unpack, and so you've laid out the gauntlet for me. Okay, so let's start. The first topic is infrastructure, or what I like to call, as an urban planner, the built environment.
Exactly.
Which the built environment includes infrastructure, it includes land use, it includes your street network, it includes all the different layers of the geographic landscape. So in North America, obviously, through our historical settlement, it's always been kind of low to medium density. It started as an agrarian settlement across a continent based upon European colonialization, the whole thing. So I think, without getting into a history lesson, the expansion of a continent and very disconnected settlements across a territory were never as highly urbanized based upon the historical fabric as the European continents. That's one. However, two, there is a notion that the United States has always been reliant on the automobile and has never been really that, I would say, rooted in public transport. However, there's another story to that, another layer to that, which is that starting in the middle to late 19th century, after our U.S. Civil War, there was a large investment in public transport networks, whether they were horse operated, whether they were electric rail or steam and powered intercity rail networks. And many of these were operated by private companies. And we did not have a national or a public operating company for public transport at that point. And a lot of these were tied, certainly in my home city of Los Angeles, California, to the expansion of investment in real estate. So if we look at a city of Los Angeles, which is a region of 12 million inhabitants across, the second largest city in the United States, yep. If we look back over 100 years, it actually had one of the largest transport networks in North America at that time. And the reason why is because private investors basically laid out electric tram lines across a wide region for real estate speculation, which created new towns and settlements across a region of Southern California, basically moving in concentric circles outside of Los Angeles. This leads to the current concept of urban sprawl in Los Angeles and the freeways we have today. But the original mode for intercity travel across these regions and territories was basically rail transport at that point, before the popularity of the automobile. So if we kind of move through history, how people moved within cities and across cities was by rail over 175 to 100 years ago in North America, including Toronto, New York, many different cities. However, artificially, there was a policy choice made at multiple levels of government as well as private industry to basically pivot the North American city towards what we call the future. And the future at that point was rooted in notions, especially during the interwar period. If we look between the First and the Second World War, there was a school of thought in urbanism, in architecture, as well as engineering, which was called modernism. Yep. And modernism was basically propelling our society out of the ancient regimes of monarchies, of dictatorships, and of old, notions of nation states to a new futurism. And the new futurism meant the city of tomorrow. So if we look at the city of tomorrow, we look at many of the key figureheads in that time period. The French-Swiss architect Le Corbusier thought of the radial city and the city of tomorrow, and these cities that were basically structured around segregated land uses and the prioritization of the future mode of transport, which was the automobile. So if we look at that, in the United States, because the United States was almost kind of a test lab for that futurism, because it had the lower densities and had the ability to grow right. and to test out these new kind of schools of thought and theories of urbanism. The US proved to be the best test bed for these, I would say, implementations, that some of which were rooted in Europe. Many of them came from France and Germany and Switzerland, but they were experimented in American cities. And what was the epitome of the American city to experiment? Los Angeles. So Los Angeles basically did a complete 180-degree pivot from rail-based transport to auto-centric mobility. Thus, we have the freeways and highways. So these were artificial policy choices made to, promote business interests, the city of tomorrow, to promote the future of America and the continent. But also there are very negative and deleterious influences at play, which were exploiting these future utopian visions, yep. which were rooted in American history. So we need to talk about race now. We need to talk about segregation. And we need to talk about Americans' dark history in what we call Jim Crow. And basically, de jure, legalized segregation in the U.S. American southern states from basically the 1870s to the 1960s. So legalized segregation basically meant that land uses zones could legally be segregated based upon blocks, buildings, etc., on skin color. And while northern states and cities did not have that legal control, because again, as a legacy of our American Civil War, which was fought over slavery and nothing else, basically the northern states, which were aligned towards abolition and towards the freeing of slaves, still had basically systemic white supremacy rooted in our entire American culture, whether it was legalized in the South or what we call the other Latin term de jure or de facto in the North. So it wasn't legalized, but it was accepted segregation. And what was the best form of non-legalized segregation in the North? Was through the separation of land uses through zoning, was by constructing highways and freeways to basically bisect neighborhoods to segregate different races, classes, ethnicities, which we saw in all North American cities, and other legalized structures that provided the ability to place covenants or restrictions on the sale and transfer of real estate and housing to different races and classes based upon neighborhoods, or a concept we call redlining in the United States. So all these legalized tools that were used to basically promote de facto segregation in American northern cities were a result or the dark side of this basically futuristic city of tomorrow, segregation of land uses, auto-centric mobility, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where we're basically at today. So that's where we hear about Joe Biden, we hear Pete Buttigieg, we talk about healing the wounds that highways basically slice through neighborhoods. It was all based upon policy choices and basically, apartheid-like policies in North America that tried to basically separate populations. And in northern cities, Constantine, it's important because, again, they didn't have the legal tools like they did in the U.S. South. But this was, if you have to look at the history of the United States, this was a reaction to what we call the Great Migration in America, where 4 million African American citizens moved from the American South to northern cities from between 1920 to 1940 and beyond to escape Jim Crow segregation. So it's really important to understand how population movement and how our cities and business interests and policymakers basically separated our cities as a reaction to these, I would say, transformations of society and tried to basically promote the status quo. So we can't even talk about mobility. We can't talk about urbanism or anything without understanding the historical and societal transformations that were happening in the United States post-Civil War, from the Reconstruction era all the way through the Civil Rights era of the 1960s. And without rooting that in our context or dialogue, we are speaking in a vacuum, in a bubble, and we don't even understand how our cities function.
Exactly. I really like your question on how many levels that you actually answered the question, because it's without directly explaining how impactful mobility is for people's lives and people's societies throughout the years. You kind of like really explained it very, very well and showed it how impactful mobility is and access to mobility, because it affects people on different parts of their lives, and it can be generational as well. So that is very important to do it very good from the start. And if it wasn't done good at the start, you can still improve now and make it better, because it impacts so many people. That is something that is often not. Public transports don't always get the credits they deserve because they are less sexy than shared mobility or whatever. But actually, public transports, I believe, is one of the most important things in people's lives and society's lives. It's what makes a society thrive sometimes, because when you look at the access to mobility, people can get to the job, they can travel around, they can, it's a part of the economy and the well-being of society. So that is something that is often forgotten. But thank you very much for pointing it out and also talking about the history. And obviously, you talked about how it influenced, the history in the United States. So another thing that I really want to discuss as well is public transports is obviously often or always regulated by the government. However, the government sometimes lags behind when it comes to using data to make policy choices or when it comes to innovation. So um, where do you think we need to find the balance to be able to be a step ahead and to be innovative in the public transport landscape? Because I believe, at least in Belgium, because that's where I have the experience, public transport has been lagging behind a little bit with the innovation and with using data to provide a solution that fits with the modern day needs. I know you have a lot of experience with that, also in the MaaS department. So that's why I really want to dig deeper on this subject as well, the subject of innovation. And I want to have your opinion on that. But I also want to see, I don't only want to discuss the problems, I also want to hear a little bit about you, what you think about the possible solutions that we can do, So I think, can you hear me?
Mhm.
Oh, okay.
So I think COVID has provided an opportunity. Yeah, yeah, yes, yes. So I think COVID has provided an interesting opportunity, or it's forced the hand of public transport authorities to now start thinking multimodal, whether they wanted to before COVID or not. We're starting to see public transport authorities be a bit more open for embracing other private shared mobility services, which is very interesting. So that is one positive outcome. It's not a problem, but it's an interesting trend we're seeing right now. And with that, I see that with public transport and the digitalization of the services, whether it's through GTFS or other data standards, we're seeing an interesting shift right now towards open APIs, as well as the ability to share either fixed schedules or real time information between MaaS platforms, and then basically be able to collaborate with shared mobility providers. So we see a more of a leveling off effect where I would say public transport is being forced, certainly here in Europe, to move away from that kind of centralized monopolistic model, which is very fixed and rooted in the status quo. And it needs to think much more on a user customer centric perspective and less just about counting passengers. So it needs to think about the quality it brings to the ecosystem, not the quantity.
Exactly.
And that changes the entire reporting of its key performance indicators, the KPIs. So, what is it going to report on right now? They're going to be focused on the accessibility of their services and the quality of their service, not just the amount of riders they transport. And that ties into this whole concept of the multimodal journey. So, not thinking of public transport in a silo as one mode or as one domain completely segregated from other modes, but thinking of how the other modes can complement and enrich their service through a network effect. And that could be either through a MaaS platform or it could be through many different digital channels. But you have to think of the digital infrastructure, this layer that enables public transport to deliver better mobility access to its inhabitants. And I think that's one area of an interesting opportunity that PTAs are starting to explore and to consider right now. I'm not saying every one of them is, but many are just simply being forced to remain competitive and to better think about kind of this post-COVID landscape and how they can provide better value. So that's one thing. But I think another thing is there's a slippery slope, as we Americans say, of embracing innovation, but not pivoting too much towards, I would say, all digital or all privatized. And that's it's a disconcerting trend I'm seeing in public transport right now. And I mentioned this before in a previous topic, which is a cannibalization of public transport and being so, I would say, seduced by technology or by shared services that maybe critical backbone operational functions of fixed route are being quickly or over time chipped away at digital services that are basically shifting riders from one service to the next. And I don't see that as a value add. I see that as, again, a cannibalization. And I think that there needs to be a lot of caution exercised by the role of taxpayer funded public authorities to maintain and influence their role as the orchestrator of shared mobility. So they need to actually take a stronger role in the future, one, not to be privatized or cannibalized, but actually to reinforce their role as that broker between the shared mobility services, not the monopoly, but that conductor, so that they can basically construct more of these meaningful multimodal journeys that provide more equitable, sustainable, and economic outcomes. And I think that that's where we start looking at some really interesting and positive opportunities. But again, I think there has to be a balance between the strong centralized role of PTAs as a conductor, but not being too monopolistic, but also not, I would say, trending towards, unfortunately, what we see historically with many North American PTAs, to use the French term, is laissez-faire, a little too hands-off, a little too free market, and allowing the private sector to basically operationalize the ecosystem. That is not a trend that we need to, I would say, work towards, because that will be at the harm of inhabitants and citizens. Although we're seeing that veiled in many different articles and thought leadership pieces recently, saying the wave of the future is autonomy in public transport, or digitalization, or innovation, or providing freedom and flexibility to have just on-demand services at your fingertips. But what are the costs of that, though? And what are the policy trade-offs? And I don't think anyone is really asking those right questions, because we're getting seduced in the marketing. So we really need to dig a little deeper and see what are the trade-offs in making these policy choices. Because at the end of the day, again, to use a lot of these Americanisms, we hand over the keys to the car, and then maybe a private driver takes that away from you, and you lose that ability to influence. So I think there's much to be said. We're seeing a lot of interesting innovation and investment in the public transport space, in MaaS, in DRT, or in the US, we call it microtransit. But we have to be careful in terms of contextually how we introduce these offers, so that they don't do more harm than they bring benefit to society. And I think that is the key, is that we don't get seduced by technology for technology's sake, just to build out a futuristic smart city and to check off all the boxes. But we're at what cost and what harm are we bringing?